Most of the roles I got, people came after me. Universal, I helped write the pictures, put them on, so I never experienced that.
There are some stories that take decades to tell, not because the truth is too complicated, but because the pain runs too deep, because the person carrying it needs time, distance, and maybe a little courage before they can finally speak. Karen Knotts is 71 years old now, and for most of her life, she has carried a version of her father that the world never fully saw. Not the rubber-faced comedian, not the 5-time Emmy winner, not Barney Fife, the lovable, bumbling deputy of Mayberry who made an entire generation feel like everything was going to be okay as long as someone, somewhere, was still laughing. Karen knew a different man, a quieter one, a more complicated one, and after all these years, she has finally found the words. The world fell in love with Don Knotts the moment he appeared on screen. There was something about him that felt both ridiculous and deeply human. The wide eyes, the trembling hands, the voice that cracked under pressure. He had a gift for playing fear in a way that made you laugh instead of cry, and perhaps that was because the fear was never entirely an act. Behind every exaggerated twitch and nervous glance was a man who genuinely understood what it meant to feel small in a world that seemed too large and too loud. The comedy was real because the anxiety was real. The performance was brilliant because the pain underneath it was genuine. Don Knotts didn't just play a frightened man. He transformed his own inner world into something that audiences could laugh at, relate to, and love. But daughters see what audiences never can. They see the man who comes home after the applause fades. They see him sitting quietly at the kitchen table when he thinks no one is watching. They hear the silences between conversations, feel the weight of things left unsaid, and grow up carrying questions they were never quite sure how to ask. Karen Knotts grew up with all of those things. She grew up as the daughter of a legend, which is a beautiful and isolating thing all at once. And now, at 71, with enough life behind her to understand what it all meant, she has stepped forward with a truth that is heartbreaking, tender, and ultimately more loving than anything else. Don Knotts was born Jesse Donald Knotts in Morgantown, West Virginia, and from the very beginning, life did not go gently with him. He was the youngest of 4 boys, born to a mother who was already 40 years old and a father who was losing his grip on reality long before Don ever had a chance to know him properly. William Jesse Knotts was a farmer who battled alcoholism and severe mental illness, and the home he created was not a safe one. There were moments of violence, moments of terror, moments when young Don would hide and try to make himself invisible. The fear he learned in that house was not abstract. It was immediate, physical, and permanent. It carved itself into the way he moved through the world for the rest of his life. What saved him was laughter, not the laughter of someone who found everything funny, but the laughter of someone who desperately needed to transform the unbearable into something survivable. His older brother Sid had that gift, and Don worshipped him for it. Sid was funny and magnetic, the kind of person who could light up a room without trying. When Sid died suddenly from an asthma attack, Don lost more than a brother. He lost his first teacher, his first audience, his first proof that humor could be a bridge between 2 people. The grief of that loss never entirely left him, but instead of letting it hollow him out, Don picked up a ventriloquist dummy and started building a world where laughter was possible even when everything else felt broken. That is the foundation Karen grew up standing on. A man shaped by loss, driven by a need to perform, and carrying inside him a tenderness that his comedy only partially revealed. She watched him win 5 Emmy Awards for playing Barney Fife, watched him become one of the most recognized faces in American television, watched audiences adore him in a way that seemed almost to surprise him every single time. And she also watched him struggle. She watched him fight battles that the cameras never captured, carry wounds that the Emmy statuettes could not heal, and search for peace in a life that had handed him very little of it from the very start. What Karen has revealed is not a scandal. It is something quieter and more devastating than that. It is the truth of a man who spent his entire career making the world laugh, while privately struggling to find solid ground beneath his own feet. Don Knotts, she has shared, lived with profound anxiety for most of his life. Not the performative nervousness that made Barney Fife so iconic, but a deep, paralyzing fear that could keep him in bed for days at a time. There were mornings when getting up felt impossible. There were stretches of time when the weight of his own mind pressed down on him so heavily that the man who made millions laugh could not find a single reason to smile for himself. In the 1950s, when his career was just beginning to find its footing, doctors prescribed him medication to manage the anxiety. It was a common practice at the time, and for a while it helped. But what began as a lifeline gradually became its own kind of trap. Don grew dependent on the medication in ways that complicated his life, both professionally and personally. He was not the only Hollywood star navigating this particular darkness. The era had a strange habit of manufacturing glamour, while quietly destroying the people at the center of it. But knowing that did nothing to make his own struggle easier to carry. He was fighting a war inside himself that had no clear enemy and no guaranteed victory. Karen watched this from the particular angle that only children of complicated parents understand. She loved him completely, and also sometimes did not fully understand him. She saw his brilliance and his fragility as inseparable things, two sides of the same extraordinary coin. She grew up knowing that her father's humor was genuine, that when he made her laugh, he meant it, that his joy in those moments was as real as anything, and also knowing that the same sensitivity that made him funny was the same sensitivity that made him suffer. There was no version of Don Knotts who was hilarious without also being haunted. The gift and the wound came from the same place. His first marriage, to Catherine Metz, the woman Karen called her mother, did not survive the pressure of his rising fame. They had met when they were young, had moved to New York City with $100 and a dream between them, and had built a life together through the early years of struggle and small victories. But fame, when it finally arrived like a flood. Long hours, social obligations, and the particular gravity of celebrity life pulled Don further and further from the quiet domestic world that Catherine had hoped for. She struggled to fit into the world surrounding the show, and the distance between them grew until it became something neither of them could close. After 13 years and 2 children, they separated. Karen was one of those 2 children left standing in the wreckage, learning what it meant to love a parent whose first and most consuming relationship was always with an audience. Don's later years brought new relationships, new struggles, and new chapters, each one carrying the fingerprints of a man still searching for something he could not quite name. He fell in love again, more than once. He battled the progressive loss of his eyesight due to macular degeneration, a cruelty aimed precisely at a man whose entire career had been built on expression and visual comedy. He went through periods of chaos and periods of hard-won clarity. He got sober. He found his way back to the work he loved. And eventually, in his 70s, he found a quietness with Frances Yarborough, the woman who became his final wife, that seemed to offer him a peace he had been chasing for most of his life. But the story Karen needs to tell is not only a story of suffering. It is, at its heart, a story about what endures, and what endured in Don Knotts through every dark season, every failed marriage, every sleepless night, every morning when the anxiety made the world feel impossible. What endured was the laughter, not as a mask, not as a performance, but as something so deeply woven into who he was that it could not be separated from him even at the very end. Karen has spoken about her father's final days with a detail that breaks your heart open and then, somehow, puts it back together again. By early 2006, Don was at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, his body weakened by lung cancer that had grown past the reach of treatment. The man who had spent decades making the world laugh was lying in a hospital bed, his voice fading, his body failing, surrounded by the people who loved him. And still, he was finding ways to make them laugh. Karen remembers a specific moment, a joke her father made from that hospital bed, something so unexpectedly funny that she and her stepmother dissolved into laughter they could not control. The tension in the room, the grief and the fear, and the helpless love of watching someone you adore moving toward the end. All of it broke apart in that moment into something that felt almost like joy. Karen was so overwhelmed that she stepped out of the room. She could not stop laughing, and she did not want to laugh in front of her dying father, and for a moment she felt guilty for it, as though stepping away from his final days to laugh in a hospital hallway was somehow a betrayal. She shared that guilt with Howard Storm, a family friend and director who had known Don for years, and what Storm told her was something she has carried ever since. He told her that what Don wanted most in those final moments was not solemnity. What he wanted was exactly what had always mattered most to him. He wanted his family to stay. He wanted them to laugh. He wanted the room to be full of the thing he had given the world his entire life. Her stepping out to laugh was not a failure. It was the most perfect tribute she could have offered him. That story, small and devastating and beautiful all at once, captures something essential about Don Knotts that all the Emmy Awards and television retrospectives somehow managed to miss. He was not funny because it was his job. He was funny because it was his survival. Laughter was the thing that had pulled him through a violent childhood in West Virginia, through the loneliness and rejection of his early years in New York, through the anxiety that kept him bedridden on his worst days, through the failures and the losses and the long, complicated middle of a life that was never as simple as it looked on screen. Every laugh he earned was a small act of defiance against everything that had tried to break him. And in the end, lying in that hospital bed, he kept doing it. He kept defying. He kept giving the thing he had always given, right up until he couldn't anymore. Andy Griffith came to say goodbye. The two men had been close in the way that only people who have truly seen each other can be close, and the years and the distance of the decades since their show had never entirely severed that connection. Andy sat beside Don's bed, and Don could no longer speak, and Andy called him by his real name, Jess, the name almost no one else used, the name that belonged to the boy from Morgantown before he became the television legend. It was Andy's way of saying, I know who you really are. Not the character, not the star, not the nervously beloved icon, the real person underneath. And Don's shoulder moved slightly, just enough to say, I hear you. I know. Thank you. Karen Knotts is 71 years old, and she has spent a lifetime being her father's daughter, which is both a gift and its own quiet burden. She grew up knowing that the man the world loved was real, that the warmth people felt watching him was not manufactured, that the connection he made with audiences across decades came from a genuine and generous heart. And she also grew up knowing the parts that the world did not see, the mornings that cost him everything just to begin, the fear that never fully left, the loneliness that fame could not cure, the love he carried for his children even when he did not always know how to show it. She carries all of that now, at 71, with the particular grace of someone who has had enough time to understand that complicated people are not lesser people, that a man can be broken and brilliant at once, that a father can fail in some ways and be extraordinary in others. That love does not require perfection to be real. What she wants the world to know, finally, after all these years of silence, is simply this. Her father was a real person, not a character, not a caricature, not just the twitching, wide-eyed deputy of Mayberry. He was a man who came from pain and turned it into joy, who gave everything he had to an audience that never fully knew what giving it cost him, who faced the worst of life, poverty, violence, anxiety, illness, loss, and found a way to laugh anyway. Not because it was easy, because it was the only way he knew how to survive, and because somewhere in him, all the way to the very end, he believed that making someone else smile was worth whatever it took. Don Knotts passed away on February 24th, 2006, at 81 years old. He left behind a legacy that is easy to summarize in awards and ratings and cultural impact, and almost impossible to summarize in any way that captures what he actually was. Karen Knotts knows that. She has always known it. And now, at 71, she has done the bravest thing a daughter can do. She has told the truth about her father, not to diminish him, but to complete him, to give the world the whole picture, to let people love him, not just for the performance, but for the person who had to fight every single day to give it to them. The laughter was real. The fear was real. The love was real. And Don Knotts, in all his beautiful, complicated, extraordinary humanity, he was real too.